listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, your host. I've got Caleigh Wells on the program. Caleigh's a reporter with KCRW covering climate, environment, and public health. Caleigh's podcast, the Anti-Dread Climate Podcast, is something I think is very interesting and intriguing. A recent guest of ours was talking kind of about it, Paul Bledsoe, and lots of young people are feeling dread about a future that could be cataclysmic. How does one address this fear? Because they are real and potentially devastating consequences to a warming planet and the increasing amount of pollutants that are being emitted, and not scare the hell out of people and promote dread. So these are some of the questions I look forward to discussing with Caleigh. Caleigh, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Matt. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your path to the environmental movement and what led you to this place.
Yeah, it's not something that I knew I wanted to do until I had started my journalism career. Knew I wanted to be a reporter, knew I really liked radio, and I sort of talk about people becoming aware of climate change as like you have a big aha moment, you have a big, oh wait, shoot, this is really scary moment. I don't feel like I remember the exact day, but I know it was right around 2018 where I thought, oh shoot, wait, everything that everyone is talking about regarding this big scary threat is actually really big and scary, and I feel like I really need to do something about it. I think a lot of people suffer with the sort of climate anxiety, climate doom, and don't know what to do with it. I have found one of the most cathartic ways to handle that is to do something, feel like I'm making a difference. And so I sort of threw my whole career and all of my professional efforts behind that goal. And KCRW, luckily, was willing to continue to fund that effort. They formalized my position as a climate reporter, which I've had ever since.
That's fantastic. So why reporting? Why journalism? What was kind of the spark behind that interest?
Oh, sure. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a writer because that was the harder thing for me in school growing up. I was much better with numbers, but I found it was much more challenging to be a storyteller. I think a lot of young people decide they want to help people, and you can either sort of, it's like, where on the funnel? Do you want to be lower in the funnel where you're like a doctor and you're saving fewer lives, or do you want to be higher on the funnel where you're connecting with thousands or millions of people, but maybe not helping them to the point of saving their lives? So I decided I'm happier more at the top of this funnel. I wanted to help more people. I think keeping people informed is incredibly important. I really believe in what journalism does, balancing what people need to know, answering what they want to know, handling all of that. That's sort of how I stumbled into journalism, knew I wanted to write, knew I wanted to help people, knew I wanted to touch a lot of people. And that's kind of where we landed.
Yeah, that's a good story. I guess I'm intrigued as somebody who's doing something similar as to kind of who the target audience is for your climate show. Is it mostly young people, or are you targeting people throughout the age spectrum?
I would say throughout the age spectrum. I know whenever we market something like this, you have to be really specific in like the person. I know one of the exercises is to name a person and come up with exactly who they are. And so yes, young people, but also the parents of young people and anyone in between. That's why my co-host is a mom, because I think a lot of our listeners aren't just the young people who are facing the fact that they are bearing the weight of this big, scary thing, but also their parents who are having young people ask really big, scary questions that they don't really know the answers to. So I would say, we've got sort of Gen Alpha all the way through Gen Z, and then I'd say most of millennials, because millennials are sort of currently parents, or considering being parents, or maybe deciding they're at that point in their lives where they're deciding whether or not to be parents, anywhere in that spectrum.
Yeah, I noticed you had an episode recently, Should I Have Children? And that's a very challenging question. And tell us a little bit about how that hashed out during the episode.
Yeah, that's a really big, scary question. And it's also a really controversial one. I'm really fascinated by the fact that it is one of the largest climate actions we choose to either engage in or not. And yet it's something that we don't feel like we can talk about. As soon as you start discussing someone's reproductive decisions, and their family planning, everybody gets really freaked out about it. Um, it's whether or not you have a kid ends up being such a big deal in terms of your climate impact, because it's not just the impact of yourself, but now yourself and the person or people you create and the entire group of people that they create after them. So that's really big and gnarly and scary. And I think there's a lot of people who are struggling with that. Our studies have shown that an increasing number of people continue to struggle with that. And the reason I really wanted to touch it is because I'm one of the people who struggles with that. I'm in my late 20s. I've been happily married for 5 years. As a woman, a lot of people like to ask me that question. And so I felt that it's appropriate to be really open about the fact that I don't have an answer, and that climate change is one of the big factors that's determining whether or not I end up doing that. I want to create a space where people feel safe to ask that and feel like they can trust that we will be careful with trying to answer it.
Yeah, there are people all along that spectrum. I had on this show a while back, Paul Ehrlich, who had kind of, I mean, for the last 50 or 60 years, been talking about kind of like population bomb type issues and the effect on kind of, feeding the world. And of course, the challenges of feeding the world did create environmental problems downstream, all the way to you have your Elon Musk types who say, hey, 10 kids is not enough. So like there are voices all along the spectrum, and it is confusing, I think, to people to where is the reasonable place on that bell curve.
Yeah. And I think where is the reasonable place is a really personal question and probably has a unique answer to you. One of the big points that people in that sort of intersection of climate and family planning will say is it's not necessarily how many kids you have, it's how impactful those kids are. You could have 3 children that have a smaller impact than 2 children. The question that I then face is, when you're talking about 0 and 1, no matter how many, if I have 1 kid, no matter how amazing that kid is, they're going to need fresh water, and fresh water is finite. They're going to need clothes. They're going to need to be able to move around. And so, yes, the answer is different from person to person. And yes, there are ways to make a responsible decision anywhere along that bell curve, almost anywhere along that bell curve. But it's a really scary, challenging one that's really controversial.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about these things. And tell us about how you see your show kind of creating changes in behavior or motivating people to act.
My hope is that at the at its foundation, it inspires people to believe that their actions do make a difference. That's why our very first question was, does anything I do matter? And then, with each episode, we discuss, okay, well, here's an action that matters, and here's an action that matters, and answering questions that way. But I think, a lot of my colleagues in climate journalism have done a really good job of raising awareness of the climate issue and convincing people that it's a big, scary thing that we need to care about. I think this podcast is sort of a working title once upon a time was Climate 102. The people have already figured that part out and are now deciding what to do about it. And so instead of getting those people to be so afraid that they bury their heads in the sand, say nothing I do will matter, and just sort of, why not drink the good wine was a phrase someone said to me recently. Instead, pulling them out, saying they're there, we're going to be okay, but take all that energy and try and recycle it into a way that's going to be productive for people. My hope is that podcast sort of gives people permission to be hopeful that they can participate in the solution, and that what they do is effective at, mitigating, adapting, combating the climate emergency.
Well, tell us, where do you draw your hope from looking at the potential cataclysm of uh, global warming going off the rails. Where do you really see that happening, or do you see that as being a little bit of catastrophizing by various people out there?
I think let me start by saying where I do not draw it from. I know, one of the arguments I've heard is, well, humanity has overcome every challenge that it has faced so far. Um, and that every person alive always feels like, well, the thing that's happening during the time that they're alive is the biggest, scariest thing that humanity has faced. I still believe that that's true. Like, I still think climate change is the biggest, scariest thing that humanity has faced. And so that argument never fully works for me. There's also the argument that life finds a way no matter what. That one doesn't work for me either, because whether or not life finds a way is not the same as whether or not humanity finds a way. So I have to reject those and find a third middle something. And my answer to that is just I am always really heartened by how resilient and adaptable humanity can be. And while I don't feel that there is proof in our history that this is a challenge we will for sure overcome, I'm watching it happen. And I know that we're not hitting the deadlines, the 1.5 degrees Celsius line, lowering this amount of methane by 2030. Like, those are big, scary deadlines that it's looking more and more likely we won't pass, which means that there will be big effects from climate change, and that they will be really scary. But I feel really confident that even if we come a little late to this party, I really think we're going to be able to show up, and I think we'll be able to do it really well eventually. I don't even
Oh,
necessarily have a great reason
I'm
for
gonna
why,
I'm
but
gonna let the listeners be on edge, waiting for the next segment to let you finish your answer. You're
okay.
listening to Climate Change. This is Matt Matter, and I've got Caleigh Wells, reporter with KCRW, who covers climate, environment, and public health on the show. And we'll be right back in just 1 minute. You're listening to a Climate Change. This is Matt Matter, and I've got Caleigh Wells, a reporter from KCRW, on the program. Caleigh, right before the break, we were talking about what gives you hope, and you were explaining kind of why you thought, hey, there is hope for humanity. We've pulled a lot out of the fire, and after doing this for about 3 years myself, of really interviewing lots of incredible people, I do think there is cause for optimism that we are making a lot of progress. It's kind of all over the place, but it's pretty amazing what we humans are capable of at our best. So I see lots of reasons for hope. I interviewed a guy named Tony Pan, who's a young guy, like under 40, who has 250 patents, who's figured out a way to strip carbon off of natural gas and create clean hydrogen, as well as another carbon compound that you can use for asphalt. So people like that kind of give me cause for hope. What Maybe I'll let you kind of finish up your answer on that front, since I cut you off a bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think stories like that, people who are finding solutions, more exciting are the ones that then pick up and take off. The difference in when I started sort of paying attention, becoming an adult maybe 10 years ago, and now, just in that period of time, there's already been a remarkable change in the percentage of energy, especially in California here, the percentage of energy that's coming from renewable sources, and other things that are cause for celebration, the composting laws that are getting passed, and things like that. And so when I think, well, all of that changed just since I became an adult, think of how much more I'm going to get to witness in 30 years, 40 years. And I think about how lucky I am that I get to be in the generation that's going to witness humanity figure this out. Like, I just can't shake the feeling that we're gonna figure it out. And even though I don't fully know how yet, I feel really good when I watch us do it every day, that we're getting closer.
Yeah, no doubt that people are doing amazing work, and that's cause for rejoicing. Though we've got a long ways to go, and where do you see kind of your call to action to people in terms of doing little things or doing lots of different things? What do you think you're shooting for in communicating your message?
I think one of the sort of frustrating things we say before any answer, basically in every episode, is it depends on your situation, depends on you as a person, what you're capable of doing. So, I can't say, well, I really want to convince everybody that they need to stop eating cheeseburgers. I can't, that's not feasible for every person that listens. But I really like the idea of shooting for something we talk about in our very first episode, which is the tipping point. This idea that once you have roughly 1 in 6 people doing something, it becomes normalized. And once something is normalized in your community, more and more people start to jump on that bandwagon, that the sort of inertia tips, and now you have done, it's now mainstream. A really good example of that in California, 1 in, I think, 3 new cars bought in California in the last quarter were electric. Now you look around, it's really hard to drive on the freeway and you don't see an electric car. That's pretty normalized now. We've sort of hit that tipping point. So when we talk about individual actions, if I just talk about whether or not I drive an electric car, that's not going to make a huge difference. But if I am part of this tipping point, then we start to see a difference. And so I hope with my listeners, I'm able to help them realize the benefit of being part of that sort of first group that leads everyone else into normalizing, mainstreaming climate-friendly action.
Well, certainly I had heard about California being in the vanguard back when I was in law school in New Orleans at the time. And I think that that's been true. I mean, it's been true for probably 100 years that California has been in the vanguard of social change and legal change and now environmental change. So that's exciting to kind of be a part of here in California, is we're seeing that we can do it. We can make this change, whether it's to electric vehicles or doing things more sustainably, improving the air quality in California with changing the laws regarding smog that gets emitted from cars and things of that nature. You mentioned cheeseburgers, and I'm gonna go back to that one because that's something that everybody kind of can address on a day-to-day basis. Are you somebody who's changed your diet to address climate change?
I have. We actually have a food episode coming out in our 2nd season, so I will talk more about that. But yes, I have changed my diet. I'm not going to say I am fully vegetarian. And one of the things that makes it hard to change your diet is when you think of it as I am denying myself certain pleasures. Like, God, I love a fried chicken sandwich. And so those are still part of my life. But I cut certain things out. I don't buy meat at the grocery store anymore. So now when I eat meat, it's because I'm eating out and it's a treat. I've decided that beef is basically for, fancy wedding occasions. If I'm going to go somewhere and steak is an option, I'm probably going to eat beef a couple times a year. I've decided pork is just not in the cards anymore because it wasn't that important to me to give up anyway. But it's the idea of, I have decided to make more climate impactful foods that I love and can't imagine living without, and make them a treat. Ice cream's probably never going to leave my life, but there is a lot more broccoli and carrots in it than there used to be.
Yeah, I'm kind of in a similar boat. I'm more or less pescatarian, but I've been certainly known to eat some red meat, so I'm not quite willing to jump into the boat yet. But yeah, I think that all of us can make changes along that spectrum, and the tipping point for everybody is at a different place. So I have friends who are more, they're vegan or whatever, and I applaud that effort. I'm just not quite there. But I think that even if I'm not willing to go full vegan, I can reduce the amount of dairy that I consume, the amount of red meat that I consume, the amount of meat in general, and probably cut down on fish too, because fish a lot of times isn't ethically raised or farmed or not sustainable according to some of my guess they kind of puncture the illusion that somehow fishing is sustainable in any way, shape, or form, which is sad because I enjoy it a lot. But these are the things that we may have to alter in order to save the whole planet, the ecosphere for everybody.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember who says the quote, but the idea of something like this doesn't come from one person doing it perfectly. It's a billion people doing it imperfectly. Um, I feel that way too, that maybe I'll have a vegan day and I celebrate it and think, wow, I did a good job today. And there are more of those days than there used to be. But if I cut 80% of the meat in my diet, then I've cut 80% of the meat in my diet. That's better than cutting 0% of the meat because I'm not willing to go 100% of the way. I think it's absolutely worth doing. And, we're talking about diet, but that's true of a lot of different climate decisions you make, and how many times you get on a plane, and how many times you get on a train instead of in a car, and all of those decisions. It's worth trying to do imperfectly because that still makes a difference.
So what do you believe are the top 5 things that you're, addressing or think are most impactful? Or do you limit your list to 5 things? I mean, it's what do you think, if you had to talk to your listeners and say, hey, these are the things that I think are most impactful, what would those things be?
I was surprised by we did an episode on this where someone asked that question, and I was surprised by the number of answers that were about doing things in the community, not just like doing something about your own personal carbon impact. The first one that our expert said was vote, which totally makes sense because, we had a bunch of plastic bags in California and then they banned plastic bags and we have significantly fewer. Like that was because some people voted in a person who decided that that was going to be a bill that they were going to write. Getting involved in local climate initiatives was number 2. Again, not something I think of necessarily, but you create a community garden and now there is a place at my farmer's market where I can bring my compost. That didn't exist 5 years ago. Personal actions is definitely among those top 5. Within personal actions, I'd say how you eat, how you move, and how you heat and light up your home. And then I would put, I don't know if we've done 3 or 4 or 5, but I'm going to say the last one is talking to your friends and family about it, because you doing anything in a vacuum is not nearly as effective as when you do something and then you are able to communicate that to the people closest to you, and affect change by inspiring them to do it as well.
Those are great things, and I think everybody can focus on those. They're very doable and very much in line with the anti-dread climate podcast that you're doing there over at KCRW. You listen to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern. I've got Caleigh Wells, reporter with KCRW, on the show, and we'll be back in just 1 minute. You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, and I've got Caleigh Wells, reporter from KCRW, who covers climate, environment, and public health. Caleigh, kind of wanted to circle back to a couple of things that we had talked about earlier, but a little bit different vein. Who are your role models when you started kind of beginning down this path towards dedicating kind of your professional career to investigating climate change?
Wow, that is a big question. I mean, the first name that comes up for me is Sammy Roth at the LA Times. The reason I mention him is because I've grown up in Los Angeles. The LA newspaper is where I learned how to play a crossword and read a comic and read the stocks. And he's sort of become the biggest face of climate coverage at the paper that I grew up with. And I've always been impressed by the kind of topics that he broaches, and his ability to make them really interesting, and question solutions. I'm a big fan of that. I have been a major NPR fan my whole career, so I'll pick, climate desk people like Becky Hersher and Nate Rott over at NPR. Their ability to make topics conversational, even though they're big and sciencey and scary. I really think trying to make something as heady and in a lot of ways invisible as climate change. You know, we can't see heat, but we can feel it, you know, things like that. Their ability to make that interesting and conversational, I think is incredibly inspiring and so important if we're going to get people to care about this kind of thing. If I'm going to go back even earlier, I'll talk about when I was a young adult, the Green brothers, Hank Green and John Green. And Hank Green is a super nerdy science YouTuber guy. He has a show called SciShow, and he's all about same thing, like embracing nerdiness, making it fun to talk about things that might seem dweeby. I think that's also important. And so I try and convey that sort of sense of fun and wonder that you can get from science topics and bring that into climate, even though climate has sort of this extra weight of, you know, doom and deadlines and all of that. I try to convey that too. All of those people definitely influence my reporting.
Well, it is kind of the ultimate science project, and we're all pieces of the experiment. So I'd say one of the challenges that I see when we're, you know, talking about these issues is the complexity of it, and that there are so many different systems in play, and that can kind of make people, even who are in the field, make their head spin at the complexity of it. How do you deal with that kind of complexity? Because there are so many things going on, whether it's the ice melting in the Arctic, or permafrost melting in Siberia, and methane being emitted all over the world. All of these different things are challenging for many people to get their arms around.
Yeah. The other thing I think of when you mention things like that are if we talk about a system, say, you know, organics recycling or recycling, and I'm reporting about the city of Los Angeles, the city of Burbank could have a completely different system. Like it's really hard to say, well, here are the steps for how to solve a problem when the steps are completely different depending on your address. And if we talk about the, you know, melting ice in the Arctic, that feels so far away that I can't imagine what I can do in Los Angeles and how that's going to affect the ice in the Arctic. So what I try and do is find like tangible evidence that is visible and is happening in your life. It is affecting what you do day to day. And I try and come up with solutions that are either applicable across zip codes or city lines or county lines, or that I try to provide tools that can get applied across those places. So here's how to find the information that is most important based on your zip code, instead of, well, here's how it works in this zip code, and hopefully it's the same over there. So yeah, trying to make things tangible and trying to provide people sort of the tools. The idea of like teaching someone to fish instead of feeding them a fish.
Well, that's a great thing, and I've often heard the phrase "think globally and act locally." And I guess for some of us who want to think globally, it is important to have people who are willing to plant our feet in the ground and say, "Hey, let's go from these kind of philosophical almost discussions about the Arctic ice, which very few of us have ever been to the Arctic." Um, to, hey, what can we do here in Los Angeles or wherever you may be, and get something done. So taking the example of the Arctic ice, what would you say? Would you say to address something like that, or just pivot and just go purely local?
So if you were to make a point about the Arctic ice, I assume we're talking about the fact that it is melting. And
Right.
so I would try and make that relevant to someone living nearby. 2023 globally hottest year. Wasn't even that hot in Southern California. So now we're having a difficult time making it relevant here, but we still can. There's still going to be a heat wave. So there's still a good time to talk about the fact that it is hotter in some parts of LA than others. We can talk about urban heat island effect. We could talk about how the city is doing in combating that, and if they're doing a good enough job handling that kind of thing. We can talk about the importance of tree canopy and how that is helpful both in changing the temperature where you live, but also capturing carbon and therefore decreasing the temperature over in the Arctic? I mean, these are just like off the top of my head, ways to make things relevant far away. I think it is possible to do things like that no matter what we're talking about. The Arctic ice is just an example.
Well, that's very well done. And I'd say, just to segue into, we have now a plant a tree for every new person who follows or subscribes to our podcast. So if anybody subscribes, they can have a tree planted in their honor. So we're trying
Love
to
that.
increase the amount of tree planting around the planet, and people can talk to us about where they'd like their tree planted, because there's great organizations out there that plant trees all over the globe and have a good track record of making sure that those trees stay growing, and that's important too. So I think that any little thing that we can be involved in to connect us to the movement. I can say just personally, there were lots of years that I was cognizant of the problem, but I didn't take any action. And so, as somebody who can maybe point to, here's some credible, or here's some useful ways that we can take some modest amount of action, is a great first step. So,
Yeah. And I would also add that taking small steps like that are also amazing for your own, mental health. Like if you sit and say, well, I'm not going to participate in the climate solution because there's no point, you're really challenging your own mental resilience. And so, why make that so hard for yourself? Like, not only are you helping the planet when you participate in something like that, but you're also getting involved in your community. You are providing yourself with control by choosing to take an action, and that sort of agency combats the feeling of anxiety and doom and hopelessness. And all of that makes you more resilient so that you can continue to be a part of the climate solution instead of sort of suffering from that burnout problem. This is another episode that we have coming up in the second season. There are plenty of selfish reasons to get involved in the climate solution as well, to sort of help your mental health, all while helping the planet too.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think that all of us have suffered the consequences of being tethered to our devices much of the day. And so this is an opportunity to get out of self and get out of just dealing with devices, and deal with real people and take some action that is different than doom scrolling through news or YouTube videos or whatever.
Yeah. And like, go outside, like go find an action that doesn't involve participating in something online. Go plant a tree or help in your community garden or do a beach cleanup if you live near the beach. All of there are so many things that communities will provide for you to be able to participate, that are free and affordable. They're just there waiting for you.
Exactly. So to that end, everybody go to climatechange.com and sign up and get your tree, and also go online to check out all the different organizations in your community that are doing this type of work. We started working with an organization, 1% for the Planet, and that 1% of the law office proceeds that I work at go towards 5,800 different environmental organizations around the world. So there are just so many different opportunities for people to connect in the way that makes sense for them. And I think most people don't know how many different places there are to work with.
Yeah, I continue to be surprised, even in my field. I continue to find new places that are doing something. Even when I walk outside or I go to the booth at the farmer's market, I find something new. There's always something there.
So the message is, keep your eyes open and tune in to listen to Caleigh's program at KCRW, the Anti-Dread Climate Podcast. as well as a climate change at climatechange.com. And we'll be right back with Caleigh to talk further about the work that she's doing to connect everybody here in LA to be not scared about the climate crisis, but to be in action. You're listening to A Climate Change, and I've got Caleigh Wells on the program. Caleigh, tell us a little bit about listeners asking you questions and how you go through the process of determining which of the listener questions will become episodes.
Yeah, the sheer enthusiasm with which the questions poured through the first time we asked for them was proof enough that there was a need for a podcast like this. We started with a call out on air, on our socials, on our website, and we are now we have more than 200 of them. When we decide what is most appropriate for the show, we choose something that is actionable, because we get a lot of questions that are like, you need to talk about big ag and all the problems. Okay, there's legitimacy to that problem, but that's not necessarily going to leave our listener with something that they can go home and do today or next week. We try and choose things that have a tangible answer. There are plenty of big, scary questions that it's just too, it depends. Something as specific as, what do I do when I need to recycle, but it's got the number 5 on it? You know, like I said, zip code to zip code, there's a really different answer for a question like that. When you have those boxes that need checked, all of a sudden those hundreds of questions, and you take out the repeats, because there are a lot of repeats, then you're down to like a couple dozen. And so, at least so far, as the podcast has gotten more popular, we are seeing a higher number of questions trickle in as we go. But that's how we end up choosing what actually makes it on the show. And we need a listener who's willing to come on and ask the question, be recorded, so that we can have the audience be able to relate to somebody.
Right. Well, it's interesting how you're going about doing it, because I guess the big ag question, I would say, oh, well, that kind of sounds interesting to me. Why not go talk about big ag and I don't know, relationship to farmers markets, or what we can do to kind of shift consumer behavior, or voting for different, laws that would have big ag be treated differently here in California or more locally.
Yeah, and there are times when we are excited enough about a topic that we will sort of work with the listener and say, do you think you can, phrase this in a way that is more related to your personal habits? An example of that was toward the end of season 1, we had someone who was overwhelmed by the amount of like plastic and trash piling up in their bins. And they were like, well, this is just such a big problem. And we said, okay, well, as we approach the holidays, like, what is it that you are personally worried about? And she's like, well, how do I celebrate the holidays without having my life just like filled with all of this plastic? Like, what am I supposed to do? So once we framed it into the what do I do framework, then it fits the episode, and we can still handle those kind of topics that people want to cover, as long as it sort of fits the podcast format and leaves audiences with some tangible solutions that they can apply.
I think that's a great idea, and something that we had had a chance to discuss with Senator Ben Allen on the program, as he was one of the authors of the plastics legislation that went through within the last year. And it's just kind of fascinating the journey that it took, and it took in part a lot of citizens who cared about this issue, and it's still not a complete solution to our plastics problem, but it was a big step in the right direction. And California again was in the vanguard in creating new rules regarding plastics that that essentially no other place on the planet has gone to that level. So
Yeah.
further.
Senator Allen is a great example because we had him on the podcast also to answer a listener's question about like, how do I get my political leaders to care because this plastic problem is so big. So we had him on and we were like, well, how do we get you and your colleagues to care? And his answer was like, well, you got to call me up. Like a lot of times the decisions that I'm making are based on my constituents, like showing up at meetings or calling my office and saying, we want to do something, or like a lobbying group or some sort of political activist group, like helping draft legislation that he then puts to his colleagues to try and turn it into a law. That ended up being a really helpful, actionable episode based on just the, oh God, plastics are scary question that we had.
Right. And fortunately, Senator Allen is such an incredible public servant and very approachable. So it's kind of seemingly less scary. And I think having him on our respective shows to like let the audience know, hey, this is somebody who's very approachable and super nice guy, and we should be asking him to do the things that we need done here in California. And not that he can just snap his fingers and make them happen, but it's a step in that direction for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And that bill that you mentioned, 383, can't actually remember the number, but the bill that you mentioned is a really good example of that, and a good example of California, you know, punching above its weight. So even if we have a listener in Montana, I know we do, that bill is going to affect how companies handle their plastic packaging, and therefore it's going to make a difference in Montana just like it will in California.
Eventually, it kind of shows industry the way that, hey, we can do this. And it's SB 54.
Thank you.
Assistant Sasha has put that up in the chat, so thank you, Sasha. And that was the California bill targeting plastic pollution through recycling mandates. So yeah, it's if we show that we can do it and it's viable, because that's one of the things that the industry is constantly saying, oh, you're going to kill us if you make the change in this law. And the truth is that that industry can survive those changes and has survived all kinds of regulations that make it harder to pollute. So that's what we need to do. Now, on the holiday front, that's a good one too. Like we all can probably use less trash when we're celebrating the holidays, and not always the easiest thing to do, but it's a step that each individual can do. I know one of my friends in the environmental movement is always kind of talking about the hypocrisy of the people on private jets preaching about environmentalism. What's your take on whether or not policymakers are walking the walk as well as talking the talk?
The private jet conversation is a really like simple example of that. That is one of the worst things you can do for the planet, is get on a plane that isn't shuttling a bunch of other people from one destination to the next. Yeah, I think there are examples of people doing that. Usually during the COP conferences, that's a great time to have that criticism, because you have people flying in from all over the world. And did you really need to send that many people? And did you really need to take a plane that isn't commercial? You know, yeah, I think there are good examples of political leaders making those decisions that are sometimes not in line with the talk that they're talking, to use your phrase.
Yeah, I think that we need to hold them accountable and say, hey, you need to walk the walk and want to hold you to a higher standard. So where do you see the Anti-Dread Climate podcast going in the future? What should we be looking for?
We have decided from, you know, season 1, we were dealing with really like tangible things that you can go home and do the next day. Season 2, we have decided to pick up some of these kind of headier topics. Like I said, climate anxiety is one of the ones that we're dealing with. Another one is relationships with your family, trying to broach big discussions related to climate with others. These are the kind of things that affect us day to day and are worth doing, but are a little less straightforward than the, well, how do I recycle question, which still was our most popular. So, I think we had a lot of success with the should I have children type question, or how do I have children in a way that's climate friendly. We got a lot of positive responses and sort of thankful reactions to things like that. And so I think we're hoping to continue in that vein, making people feel comfortable in the discussions that we're having and comfortable asking the scarier questions so that they can be a part of the solution in every form, the easy and the hard tasks.
Well, I really like the practical approach and the fact that you're making it very clear what people can do to make a difference. And so I greatly encourage the audience to check out your Anti-Dread Climate podcast at KCRW and tune into your program. It's great chatting with you, and wish you all the best going forward. And we'll look forward to collaborating with you on communicating these ideas out to a wider audience. So check out our podcast at climatechange.com. And as I said earlier, subscribe and follow us on Apple or iHeart or Spotify, and we will plant a tree in your honor. So everybody have a great week, and look forward to having you tune in next week.